So I posted a couple days ago about this AI agent that I built in Zapier and had a lot of interest from people interested in learning how it was built. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about Zapier AI agents and just like the basics you need to know about using them. And then I will show you how I built this particular agent in Zapier. So to start, let's just kind of look at, this is like the page where you can learn about AI agents in Zapier. It is a pretty new feature of theirs, a new product of theirs. So there's, certainly a lot more for me to learn. I think there's a lot, we're just like at the tip of the iceberg whenever these new technologies come out, in terms of, the real possibility of using them. And I'm hoping that by sharing this, that I'm helping you to be able to use this technology, because that's how we all learn, is from other people who are just testing things out, especially in this AI world. I wanted to jump quickly to talk about just like the pricing. So if you have an existing Zapier account, maybe you could make one for free as well. But it's my understanding that if you have a paid Zapier account, that this feature is free, at least in terms of basic functionality, which they measure, I would say, primarily by this like activities per month. So it says every action an agent takes, like starting a behavior, browsing the web, or reviewing data for answers, counts as an activity. And I'm pretty sure, but not 100% positive, that whenever I'm like testing a behavior, that's probably an activity too. And so again, it shows you some details. What's really cool too is you can make a Chrome extension. You don't have to make it. It already exists, but you can call your AI agent into Chrome. I can show you really quick here what that looks like. And I haven't built mine necessarily to work for this purpose yet. And maybe because I wasn't logged in on this page, it's not going to do that. But anyway, that's where it would show up. Here it is. Okay. So let's go ahead and now jump into the tool itself. So for those of you who know Zapier, lots of different solutions, and they've been releasing a lot of new things, even in just like the last year, even in the last like quarter. So it's a lot to keep up with, but they all kind of talk to each other and make sense. So it's like, if you understand how to use Zapier for automations, kind of like the initial use case of Zapier, probably the most widely used one for now, then you will be well set up to use Zapier agents. And there are a lot of different agent models and tools that you can use. I chose to start with this one because it feels really approachable, and because it has that Zapier connectivity where you can pull in, different documents. You can pull in the functionality of another app. You can make the apps communicate with each other. So that's why this one seems not only approachable, but also just like really useful for a lot of different use cases that most businesses that use, the types of tools that connect with Zapier would benefit from. So this is like the agent itself. What you can see on the far left is like all my past chats with it. And it really is like you're interacting with it like a chat, at least when you're kind of building it out. The end result of this is not really chat based, but again, that's kind of how I've built this. And so, mostly how I'm using the chat here is to troubleshoot things, to add new functionality and things like that. But depending on how you build your agent, chat might be useful for that. And that's where like these browser extensions would come in handy. So, and then you can see on like the far left, these are the different agents. I have another one that I've been working on, and it's also, the other one's also really close to being like exactly what I want. So I'll probably share that in the future. It's like a job lead qualifier. It looks at URLs, and then I gave it a document based on like my lead qualifiers, and it qualifies them, and then it searches my portfolio, suggests some relevant portfolio items, and then it generates kind of like a draft email. So that one's pretty cool. But today we're talking about my trending news agent. And so I'm just trying to think if there's anything else I want to share about like this particular interface. You can see in the chat has like find data, take action, run behavior. Those things for my workflow make the most sense when we're talking about the configuration. It has all those same options there, so I'm going to talk about that in terms of that. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else I want to talk about here. I actually didn't notice that you could share your agent, so that's actually really cool. Yeah, it's pretty simple though. There's not a whole lot to it. It's not a super like, you're not interacting with something that's like a super technical user interface. A lot of it is really like plain language. So let's go to configure. All right, so you name it. You can give it a description. I don't know that the agent interacts with either of these things. It doesn't really matter for my purposes, I guess, because it works without those things, but it's useful for you. It's always good to name the different like automations you create, in this case agents, and it's good to also name the steps. I think those are just Zapier best practices in general. You can also see that I've given it access to some data sources. In this case, it's our social media guidelines document that goes through things like, hashtag use and formatting for different networks and our blogsmith voice, things like that. And then I also connected this Airtable base that I'll explain a little bit more once we get into the behaviors. So there's 2 behaviors, and basically these are just like the steps of your agent. And so initially I had put these all together in one behavior, but I've since learned that it kind of makes more sense to separate them out. And that way too, it's like if one of the behaviors is working but the other one isn't, it doesn't like destroy the whole workflow. So just a best practice that I've learned with testing. So we'll go ahead and click on this one. And so this behavior is finding and analyzing the news. And then in the next behavior, it is creating a social post based on that news item, that analysis, and the Blogsmith social media guidelines. Okay, so they all start with a trigger. And like I said, I don't really interact with the chat with this particular agent because I kind of want everything to happen automatically and without me. And so like for this one, I have it triggered for basically the beginning of the day. It's like I want it to catch kind of like any news items that have happened, from the last workflow run at the same time the day previous until now. And morning just seems fitting. You can obviously make it whatever you want. And so then we get into the instructions. And I'm just going to pull my little bubble over here. So I gave it, it's like each section and kind of the top has like a summary of what we're doing. I think that's more for me than for the bot. I haven't tested it without that, but I think you could get away with it. But I'm just explaining that, yeah, that's kind of what's happening here. This is kind of what's happening, a description of it, but this is what's actually happening here. And there's some sort of like remnants of things that I've tested that I haven't fully like taken out when I've gotten to like a better solution, which will make more sense as we go through. But basically, this is what it does. Perform a Google News search. I gave it a couple of different queries, and then identify like 5 new developments. And we get a little bit more specific here in terms of what those requirements are. Like, I'm looking in like these particular sort of like departments, how this news affects those. I want the news sources to be recent. I think I had something here about, I don't know if I'm going to see it right now. Oh yeah. Focus on practical tools rather than speculative concepts, things like that. So this part was actually the part that wasn't working because this agent wasn't actually doing a live search. And I know it said on here, the pricing, that it does web browsing, but I think that's still even kind of different from what I want. I've experienced that aspect of it working, but not in this workflow. So what I ended up doing was I attached a search API, which you can start to see here. And I'll just explain that because it pretty much overwrites the rule that I had initially put in that wasn't actually working the way I wanted it to. And so I will delete this later, but I want to test it and stuff before I do that. And I just want to show you how I got there. So basically the way that I inserted this API was by clicking on insert data. And then, it's webhooks. So again, like kind of what you know about, actually it's an action, I'm sorry. What you may or may not know about Zapier, some of these different like actions and things like that, they're very similar to how it would work in like a Zapier automation. So that was pretty intuitive for me, having done this before in a Zapier automation, doing it here. But it's pretty straightforward. This was like a GET request. And so you add the URL for the API, and then I specified send as JSON, and then JSON is the key, I guess. But for the most part, you don't have to know all the answers here. I think I asked ChatGPT for how to add this specifically to a Zapier agent because it's different than an automation. And really, for the most part, where there's like these different options here, you can have the agent select that option for you. You can also tell them not to interact with the field, which you'll see in a different part of this workflow. So that's pretty much what I did for this one. I mostly just added the URL. I did change these based on what ChatGPT told me, and then I left the rest alone. So I'll go ahead and delete that. But that's how that news portion was set up. With your workflow, something like that, it may or may not make sense. You may not need like live search data, but that's how I got around it. And that was like the last piece of making this work. That was mostly the last piece of making this work. Okay, so we went through kind of the requirements. So now the next step is that it is analyzing and like reporting back its analysis of these different news items that I asked it to search for. I guess one more thing I wanted to say with this is I gave it just one thing to search versus the initial query, and like the version 2 or whatever I'm on with this agent would be multiple searches and then combing through those searches to find like the most relevant things that I actually that are relevant to like the requirements here. So that would be like a version 2. If this is the MVP, like that's the next step. So anyway, for each news item that it finds, and as you'll see here, I think I tell it to find like 5 or something like that, 5 new developments. It's never actually done that. It usually does like 2 or 3, and that's maybe based on like the context window of what an activity is, because it's like, you know, with one workflow run, it's not going to do like 500 things, right? It's going to sort of like error out at a point or just like cut itself off before it's like you need to run another activity. So anyway, that's another thing, is like it's not always going to like explicitly listen. There's also like limitations to keep in mind, and you want to keep that in mind when you're structuring it. So yeah, for each of those news items, then I'm asking it to create this report, and this is formatted kind of badly because it should look like this. And so yeah, it's like summarize it. Why does it matter? And then I also added like, why should a CMO care? Because on the other part of this workflow where I am asking it to generate a social media post, I want it to have that angle. I want it to generate a post that the blacksmith would post for a CMO audience in this particular use case. And you can see, you know, some of the other things I asked it, but there's also this like must also include, and that should also probably be up here. I think it's ignoring that right now because I basically wanted to get more than just one URL as like the news source. Maybe it does it in that, and let's just look really quick. I haven't been counting on that working, so I've kind of ignored it. Let's see. Yeah, it just has the source URL. So we'll get to this in a second. I just wanted to see. So that's another thing to keep in mind, right? Is like you can give it all these instructions, but unless you're giving the instructions in a way that it understands, it's probably just going to ignore them. So I need to like re-examine how I can get additional URLs, and maybe that's another like, you know, Google News like API call. I don't know. I'm figuring this out as it's happening. So next, this does work. Add a step in the workflow that stores the news items in Airtable with the daily category. And then I had to set up this Airtable action, which you can see here. It basically shows you, you know, like here's kind of a preview of the ones you've already set up, and then you can go down here and set up other ones. So for this one, it's going to a specific Airtable base, you know, from my specific Airtable account, which was already connected because of my Zapier automations, which was nice. A specific table, and then everything else says let the agent generate a value for the rest of the fields I'm going to show you. One thing that I might do, like updating this, is for any field that I don't need it to generate a value for, these ones in the middle, for example, What I could say is don't include a value for this field. And then, the AI is not going to interact with it at all. Maybe it saves me, some activity stuff, some token stuff, however that works. Okay, and so basically I want it to add what we just did, finding the news and analyzing the news and creating a record of it in Airtable. I also wanted it to tag it with a certain category so that it wouldn't go with the rest of the social media posts that I have here. So this base is just like my Airtable base for everything to do with social media. It's kind of a knowledge base in a sense. It's mostly just like a repository of different just like templates and materials, instructions, whatever, SOPs that I've put together. And so this particular table is like every sort of social idea that I have, things that I want to post about, that I just haven't posted about yet, and just like a place to gather those ideas, any sort of like relevant details. You can kind of see that I've played around with some other stuff here. In addition to just that, but for the purposes of what we're talking about today, this base just exists to capture my social ideas, and so that's what it's doing here. And I accidentally put some stuff that I wanted to put in the main social area, so that might have actually messed it up a little bit. But so we'll look at this part. And so you can see it adds as like a post needed. It just adds like a quick title, and then here is the summary that I asked for. And then this will be the next step. But let's go ahead and jump back. Okay, so yeah, so it did that step in basically the name and the context. That's all we've done so far. And so then this is like specifically what I wanted to see in Airtable. And I'm looking at it and I'm kind of thinking like, does that need to be a separate step, or should it be like part of this step? Does that matter? Because it seems to be working, but I'm just thinking about best practices. Anyway, so it takes everything we already talked about and it puts it there. And then this was a note: when creating Airtable records, ensure the content length is concise and formatting is simplified to avoid exceeding Airtable's field limits or causing errors. I think because some of this was getting really long, and so it was like posting in like the neck, like a new row or something like that. There's definitely some reason for adding that. And so when you interact with the agent itself, and here's exactly where it happened. It'll kind of like make its own notes, and it will add them to your agent. And typically, I think it adds it to the bottom of like what you've already been working on. It doesn't add it like contextually where it matters. So that's just another thing to keep in mind, is like whenever it's like saving this feedback, it's likely putting it here, and you might have to like rework it into your into the rest of your workflow. So then anyway, we did make some changes. Mostly I think it was formatting, so I'm just gonna go ahead and save, and then I could retest it. And I would highly recommend doing that for any changes you make, because you don't know like how that might have unintentionally affected something later in the workflow, especially if there are like some different dependencies, like how we're using Airtable to kind of like get all this information in one place. I'm not going to do it now because it's going to take forever. But understand that as like a necessary step, and also to just like make sure the logic is working. So that's the first behavior. Now let's look at what happens when we combine one behavior with another behavior. All right, so the next behavior is to generate the social media posts for the news that we just looked at. Again, this one has a trigger that is time-based because I made this workflow so I don't have to interact with it when it's working. I put it for like 15 minutes after the previous because I'm not totally sure if this makes sense or not, but whenever I retest the behavior, it seems to take, a significant amount of time to get through the workflow. It's not instantaneous, and it makes sense. It's doing different steps. And so if that's indicative of how long the workflow actually takes to run, I want to make sure that I'm like well outside that window of like, where it may be looking for more information and making the workflow take a little bit longer. So that's my reasoning here. It's not totally scientific. Again, I'm kind of like labeling, what this is. Probably not necessary, but it's also not hurting anybody, so I leave it there. One thing that I need to figure out is like, can I use Markdown in here? Can I create, like subheadings and stuff like that to add additional context with formatting? So that's just like a pending question for me. And again, it may not matter to you because you may not care about adding that formatting here, but it is useful, I think, as you're like troubleshooting things to have context, even if the agent doesn't need it. Like, you may still need it, and it's handy to have it in one place instead of, you know, looking in a notes app or something like that. So anyway, our first step here is to retrieve details about posts needed from that Airtable base. And this, I think, is just data. So this is like if you click insert data, and as you can recall from the beginning of this workflow, these were our data sources for this workflow. And maybe it's a good time to also say, like, it's not enough for me to just say from that connected Airtable database and leave it at that. Like, for every action, it needs an action. For every time you're calling specific data, you need to do it like the proper way. And I learned that the hard way, because it's like I kind of took for granted, like I've already connected these, or I've already like set that action, but you need to be explicit at this point. I think that's the best practice in general. AI seems to do best with really explicit details, with, you know, useful context. And so you can't just like assume that it understands what you're saying, especially because it's not going to have the same response every time, right? So we want to give it as much specifics as we can to try to get as close to the same type of response each time. Obviously, the difference being the different news items and the different social posts, but in terms of the workflow itself. Okay, so yeah, so I said retrieve details about posts needed, this column, for anything that's tagged with that daily category that I showed you. So I don't want it to do it for all the social posts that I need posts for. I just want it to do it for those. And use the last modified date field to determine and retrieve new records relative to the last workflow run. This is something I think that's really cool about Airtable, and probably a lot of other tools do this too. But you can automatically add a field that's like, okay, here's when this was added, and then here's when it was modified, if ever. And so this kind of acts as like a rudimentary memory then for this, because we're running this every day. There's going to be new inputs, and so you have to give the agent something to determine what those new inputs are. Having a date seems perfect. You could also maybe like probably say something like, hey, if you've added something to this like AI copy field, which is where our social posts go, like you've already run the workflow for that item. So that would be another thing to like look for. Like if that's done, then you can go to the next one. But that's just how I handled it here. Okay, so then for each record, create a LinkedIn and Twitter social media post for the blacksmith to share, positioning the agency as a thought leader in content operations, workflow automation, and AI-powered marketing. So then I gave it some sub notes here to use this particular data item that I inserted here, these guidelines to write the copy. And then I also said if you could like look in the rest of this base. And so like I defined for each of these tabs like different descriptions of what the tab holds. All that's to say that I don't think these steps are actually working the way that I want them to right now. And I think that it's because what I'm really looking for is more of like a RAG model that like really like deeply understands the documents I gave it and like their purposes. But I guess I could also say that like I've given it some of this like context and specificity, but it's probably not enough. So like if this workflow is like 97% of the way there, that's like the 3% that it's not mission critical for that to work. I've given it a lot of other context, but that would make it actually perfect. So it's my idea that's not quite there yet. You know, I think it is listening to the rest of this, like avoid jargon, focus on insights. I think it's actually not doing this. So yeah, this whole step, it needs a little bit of work, but I think it is following these steps here, which is mostly formatting for the LinkedIn post and then like the Twitter posts. And this is basically just like chunking that document that I gave it, right? So it's like, even if it's not fully understanding that document, it is like sort of understanding as I was working with the agent, that these were like going to be important for understanding that it was working, at least rudimentarily. I'm not saying it right. Rudimentarily. Okay, anyway, so yeah, you can kind of like look and see the basic guidelines I gave. They're not really the ones that I want it to follow, but it'll work for now. And then in this case, I'm trying to remember where I put this. Each social media post focuses exclusively on its respective source. And then I said, like, make sure that you make the social post before marking this task is complete. That was from a previous workflow run where it was like, kind of picking and choosing what it wanted to do. So sometimes you do need to add explicit stuff like, hey, this isn't done until you do this. And yeah, just saying like, don't skip it. So I don't know how necessary that is, but it was necessary at a time building this workflow. Okay, so then it says record results of steps 3 and 4 in the AI copy field for each of the new posts needed. And as you can see, I added another action here to update the same base, the same table, and then the agent picks the record because there's going to be multiple records here. So I don't want it to like be hard coded to, just like one or something like that. And then again, I would probably change this to say like, hey, the agent doesn't need to generate a value for any other fields. It's just the one. Okay. And then I said include error details for any part of the workflow and any partial results. The AI generated copy should be stored in Airtable in addition to also then being sent to Slack. Okay, so sorry, I missed this part. The last part of this workflow is it ran the news analysis, or it found news, it analyzed the news per the specific angle I gave it. It then, adds those details to Airtable, which is then when this step takes over to retrieve those details from Airtable based on the date and what's actually new and what doesn't have this step done for it yet. It creates the social copy using at least some of the guidelines that I've provided. And then finally, it all comes full circle by posting the results of all of this in Slack. So it says send notifications to Slack. I have it sent to a specific channel, and then the agent generates whatever other fields. Success is that each new item in Airtable with that post needed, tagged with the daily category, sharing these particular fields, context and the AI copy, which was what we did in the previous step for context at least. And then, so the error, it's basically just defining like this is success and like this is like not success. And so, so basically like if you didn't finish it, I just want to know what you did do and like what didn't work. And I don't know if that error function is working or not. But again, that's the goal. So here's kind of the end result. And it's not perfectly consistent day over day. So that's also like a version 2 is like making sure I've given enough very clear directions. Cause like I'll give you an example. This one has like context and then it has the posts and then like some of them have context in like a different way. It doesn't give like the full context. So anyway, I'm just pointing out that this workflow looks more or less the same each run, but it is different. And if I had given it a little bit more detail, then it would work better. So, so here's the end result. We have these new posts. Here's kind of the title of the news item, the context that we asked it to get. And then here's the LinkedIn post, and here's the Twitter post. And here's another workflow run. And it seems like this workflow run actually shared an item that has been shared before, but I think it has a different URL. So it's not the thing that I would add to a future version. Like if you've covered this general topic, I don't want to see you doing this again. But anyway, I think that covers it. So I think it's definitely overwhelming to play around with this for the first time. It's less overwhelming if you are a Zapier user of their base automation product. And I tried to build this workflow first as a ChatGPT task, but the inability to do like a live search of trending news made it impossible. But I thought that this was going to be actually a really simple thing to do, and it was that piece of it that was actually really the hardest. And so I also tried to build this, I guess, no, I'm thinking of another workflow that I tried to build with like a custom GPT. So yeah, never forget that. But just suffice it to say that like the more you sort of like tinker around with these things, like I don't have a formal education on AI agents. I've just been playing around with different tools, and it really was like trial and error, and like some of the things that I explained today, you know, in terms of like what's the next step. Like there's still more to learn, and I could still make this workflow even better. But you know, this is like the workflow that that I had initially really hoped to build in ChatGPT, and seeing it working is great, and I'm excited to build it further and to do things, you know, for other use cases too. So if you like this video, I could also share that more of like the sales AI agent that I built that analyzes jobs, and does the other steps that I talked about earlier. So let me know. I would love to share that one too if this is useful.